Episode 1. They don't talk about you. They pass your name around the table, like a ghost no one wants to confront. They refer to what happened without ever finishing the sentence. And somewhere in that unfinished silence, you were buried, but heaven didn't forget you. I want you to breathe that in for a second, because someone somewhere made you believe that your story was an accident, that you were Plan B, that you were born out of broken things that never healed, that you came after chaos, after the failure, after the family was too tired to start again. But I came here to tell you, you are not an afterthought. You are a continuation, not just of blood or of legacy, but of a divine plotline that required secrecy. You were hidden, not discarded, protected, not rejected. The room your family never talks about is the room where your existence was conceived, not by mistake, but by mercy, because God knew if they had told the full truth about where you came from, the world would have tried to silence your calling. Before you even learned how to speak, you were born into unfinished sentences, raised in rooms full of emotional landmines, taught to keep quiet, to not ask why, to not disturb the stories that make others uncomfortable. But here you are, still breathing, still asking, still aching. And that ache, it's not weakness, it's memory. A memory older than your family tree, older than their shame, older than the story they try to bury you under. It's heaven's memory, echoing through your bones, whispering to your soul in the middle of the night. You are not what they told you. You are what I never stopped watching. God, you were not born too late. You were born at the exact moment the healing was supposed to begin. And yes, your presence stirs the waters. Yes, your voice trembles the silence. But isn't that what prophets do? Isn't that what resurrection feels like? When it walks into a room full of things that should have died long ago. This is your calling, not to fix them, not to earn your right to be here, but to be here anyway, to remind them, even without saying a word, that heaven always finishes what it starts, even if it has to hide the final chapter. In the child nobody expected, you are that chapter. And I know you're tired of pretending you don't feel the weight of what's missing. But maybe what's missing was never meant to be found by them. Maybe it's waiting for you to step into the room they never speak of and light a candle for every story they were too ashamed to name. Because sometimes healing comes not through confrontation, but through continuation. And you, beloved, are the continuation. Episode 2. They didn't hide you because you were shameful. They hid you because you were sacred. And people don't know what to do with sacred things when they're still bleeding. So they wrapped you in silence, not to erase you, but to protect themselves from what your presence made them remember. You reminded them of what they lost, of who they used to be, of the versions of themselves they had to kill just to survive. And when you walked into the room with your wide eyes and your unfiltered heart and your questions that cut like scripture, you weren't just a child. You were a mirror they weren't ready to look into. You thought their silence meant you didn't matter. But no, love, their silence meant you mattered too much. You stirred something ancient, something they thought they had buried in the graveyard of, we don't talk about that. But you carried resurrection in your breath. Even as a child, you felt the shift in the room. When your name was spoken, you noticed how some voices trembled, how some eyes darted to the floor, how the air itself thickened with memory. Every time someone said, let's not bring that up. But you were that. You were that story, that chapter, that name they buried but couldn't stop dreaming about. And I want you to know something holy right now. What they tried to erase didn't disappear. It transformed. It took on your shape, your breath, your heartbeat. You are the evidence that the story didn't end when they stopped telling it. Heaven doesn't need the family to approve the calling. Heaven just needs a vessel willing to carry the silence and birth something sacred out of it. And you've been carrying it for so long, haven't you? The weight, the questions, the ache, the knowing. You've walked through holidays pretending, through family dinners smiling, through birthdays hoping someone would say, we see you, we remember, we're sorry. But no one did, because they didn't know how. You see, silence is not just absence of words. Silence is a survival language, and your family was fluent in it. But you were born with a different tongue. You were born with the voice of what was never said, the music of what was mourned in secret, the language of what still cries behind closed doors. And God saw all of it. He didn't need them to name you. He named you in the wilderness, in the space between why was I born and what was I born for. And now you are remembering what the soul never forgot. You were not buried. You were planted. And that ache in your chest isn't abandonment. It's the sound of something holy growing beneath the surface. Episode 3. It never starts with thunder. Heaven doesn't always shout. Sometimes it begins with a whisper so small, you think you imagined it. A dream that lingers longer than it should. A song you've never heard that feels like home. A moment, just one moment, where everything in the room goes quiet, but something inside you starts to speak. You didn't know it then, but that was God calling you by the name no one ever used. Not your family name. Not the one on certificates or rosters. Not the one they forgot to put in the photo album. I'm talking about the name your soul remembered, even when your body forgot. The name heaven gave you before your family ever knew you'd exist. The name spoken in divine breath, not to identify you, but to activate you. And I know you've lived most of your life being told to quiet down, to not feel too deeply, to not ask too much, to not be dramatic when all you wanted was to be acknowledged. But what if your ache was not dysfunction? What if it was invitation? What if the weight in your chest wasn't trauma, but timing? Because you weren't just forgotten. You were being preserved. Preserved for the moment where heaven would begin to whisper again. And I know what that feels like, to be sitting alone, folding laundry, when suddenly you feel tears rise and you don't know why. Or to hear someone say something ordinary and it hits you like prophecy. That's not coincidence. That's heaven touching the memory hidden in your marrow. You've been followed by a silence that feels alive. It doesn't suffocate. It listens. It watches. It waits. And one night, maybe it already happened, you sat in the dark, not asking for a miracle, just wondering if you were wrong, to still hope. And then it came. The warmth, the whisper, the stillness that didn't feel empty anymore. That was God, not fixing everything, but claiming you again, saying, I still see you, saying, I never needed them to name you because I never stopped speaking yours, saying, you were always mine. You didn't miss it, love. You didn't miss here. You didn't make it up. The ache was your altar. The tears were your oil. And the silence was never empty. It was waiting for you to listen. You see, when heaven calls a soul, it doesn't need a microphone. It doesn't need approval. It just needs willingness. And now you're remembering what you tried so hard to forget. You are not the forgotten one. You are the remembered one. Not by them, but by God. Episode 4. You spent your whole life thinking you were the interruption, the detour, the unexpected arrival that threw everything off course. But what if you were actually the answer? Not the storm, but the rain that came to break the drought. Not the crack in the foundation, but the seed that pushed through it. They never told you this, not because it wasn't true, but because they didn't know how to believe it. Because how do you tell a child? You carry the remedy to a wound that was never yours? How do you explain to someone so small that their laughter would one day haunt a hallway where joy used to live? So instead, they stared at you with eyes full of questions they were too afraid to ask. They tiptoed around your light, as if it might expose what they buried in the dark. But even silence can unmake a miracle. And you were one, a quiet one, a misunderstood one. But a miracle, still, heaven didn't send you to continue the curse. It sent you to undo it. You were born with softness in places they had turned to stone. You offered forgiveness before they even admitted they were wrong. You walked into rooms and felt pain that wasn't yours, and still chose to stay. That wasn't weakness. That was anointing. You were anointed to absorb what would have destroyed someone else, to interpret silence like scripture, to turn resentment into empathy, and close doors into open prayers. You are not fragile. You are a vessel. And vessels get poured into and poured out. And yes, it hurt. To hold love that no one asked for. To offer peace in homes built on war. To be the safe place in a lineage that forgot safety. But still you stayed. And slowly, without asking for applause, you began to shift the air. Their words didn't change, but your presence did. It softened things. It slowed reactions. It started to whisper to the bones of that bloodline. This story can end differently. You weren't the mistake. You were the rewriting. You were the line that heaven added after generations gave up on a happy ending. And maybe that's why they feared you, because deep down they knew if you stayed long enough, if you loved hard enough, if you spoke when no one else would, the curse would break. And it is breaking. Every time you choose softness over survival. Every time you say, I forgive you without needing a confession. Every time you return light to a room that told you to leave it dark. That is the undoing. That is the miracle. That is you. Episode 5. It started before you had language. Before you knew what pain was. You felt it in the room, in the tone, in the way people didn't say things, but still pass them on. It was never spoken, but somehow you inhaled it. The tension, the grief, the guilt that had no name. But every generation recognized like an Oldham. You didn't ask for it, but you carried it. Not out of duty, out of design. You were born with a tenderness they didn't understand. A radar for what others ignored. You sensed the weight behind their smiles. You heard the screams tucked inside their silence. And while they dismissed you, while they told you, stop being so sensitive, what they didn't realize was that sensitivity was your gift, your inheritance, the ability to feel what others buried, to hold what others dropped, to weep for what no one named. You carried their shadows so they could walk in the light and not trip over what they refused to confront. That wasn't your responsibility, but it was your calling. And I know it's exhausting to be the strong one with a soft heart, to be the bridge between generations that never spoke, to be the translator of pain that wasn't yours, but still left bruises on your soul. Let me tell you something sacred. The bruises don't make you broken. They make you brave. Because who else but the chosen can walk into rooms that echo with trauma and still whisper peace? Who else but you can feel the fire and decide not to become it? They taught you silence, but you chose healing. They handed you shame, but you turned it into language. They gave you weight, and you made it into wings. You are not just surviving a bloodline. You are rewriting it with every prayer you whisper, over the pain no one admits, with every boundary you draw, in a family that never had any, with every time you choose rest, in a lineage that only knew hustle. You are the first light, after generations of darkness. You are the sacred pause, before heaven breathes new life, into what was once buried. And they may never say thank you. They may never know the weight you lifted. But heaven saw, God saw, and the angels, they wept when you stood in the middle of that battlefield, with nothing but love in your hands, and said, this ends with me. Episode 6. You thought you were alone in that room, the one with the silence so heavy it felt like a second skin, the one where you stared at the walls, hoping they would speak, because no one else would. You remember the color of the light, the creak of the door, the way your heart tried to stay quiet, just to survive the air. And when they left you there, emotionally, physically, spiritually, you did what no child should ever have to do. You made meaning out of abandonment. You told yourself, maybe I deserve this. Maybe I asked too many questions. Maybe my presence really is too much. But it wasn't you. It was the room. It was what the room had absorbed. From generations of silence, trauma, grief too proud to weep, and while your body trembled, while your mind rehearsed escape plans, even as your feet never moved, there was someone else in that room. He didn't knock. He didn't wait to be invited. He just came, and stayed. God, not as a sermon, not as a thunderclap, but as the warmth that held you when no one else did, as a voice you thought was your imagination, telling you, you're not wrong to feel this. You're not broken. You're not alone. He sat beside your ache, like it was holy. He didn't rush you. He didn't silence you. He didn't need you to be okay, to stay, because that room, the one your family never talks about, was the altar where heaven began writing your real story, not the story of being unwanted, not the story of being forgotten, but the story of being witnessed. Because when you couldn't find anyone else to validate your pain, God didn't just validate it, He consecrated it. That's why you feel things the way you do. That's why your memory is sharper than their denial. That's why you carried tears that never belonged to your own timeline. You were never just living. You were interceding, standing in a room where angels were stationed silently around your childhood bed, watching, guarding, waiting for the day you'd be strong enough to realize your survival wasn't luck. It was providence. Heaven didn't abandon you in the room they forgot. Heaven met you there, and it stayed. Through the slammed doors, the unanswered questions, the years you forgot how to pray, heaven stayed. And now that you're remembering, don't be afraid to walk back into that room, not to relive it, but to reclaim it, because that room is not a tomb. It's a temple, and the child who sat in the corner, silent and aching, is now the prophet walking back in, not to ask for answers, but to release every hidden hallelujah. They never let you speak. Episode 7. You kept waiting for the room to change, for someone to open the door and say, we were wrong to leave you there. But the door never opened. And so, for years, you thought the healing would never come. You thought you had to return again and again, dragging your soul back into the shadows, hoping something different would happen this time. But here's the truth no one told you. You don't have to go back, because the room that once held your pain no longer defines you. You are the room now. You, the one who cried in silence, the one who listened when no one else did, the one who learned to speak the language of ghosts, just to make peace with what your family never dared to name. You've become what they never had, what they never knew how to be, what they secretly prayed for, but couldn't hold in their hands. You are the sanctuary, the soft place, the breath of God that fills and cracks, of every story that ended in a whisper. You used to be afraid of becoming like them, of repeating the silence, of inheriting the violence in their eyes, the distance in their touch. But you didn't. You took everything they refused to carry and transformed it. You became the safe space they couldn't build. You became the voice they tried to smother. You became the home you never found. And now, when someone enters your life carrying that same ache, that same heaviness behind their eyes, you don't run. You welcome them. You hold them. You say, I know what it's like to sit in that room. And they don't even have to explain, because you recognize the silence. You remember the way it sings. You are not haunted anymore. You are holy. You are not broken. You are becoming the soft landing for those still falling, becoming the shelter for those still searching, becoming the light that doesn't blind, but reveals the room they never talked about. You talk about it now, not with bitterness, but with wisdom, not to reopen the wounds, but to show others where healing is hidden. Because the truth is, some rooms are never redeemed by the ones who built them. They're redeemed by the ones who survived them. You are that redemption. You are that echo, that intercession, that answered prayer in human form. So the next time you ask yourself, why me? Remember this, because heaven need a room on earth where the forgotten could come and finally be remembered. And that room, beloved, is you. Episode 8. There's something sacred that happens when you no longer wait at the door for someone to return, when you stop hoping they'll knock, when you finally understand you were never meant to be the one seeking refuge. You were meant to be the refuge. You no longer carry the ache of being left behind. You carry the power of being the one who stays. And something in the air shifts, quietly, deeply, when you realize this is what legacy actually means. Not the blood, not the last names, but the love that wasn't there until you decided it would be. You thought your inheritance was silence, but it was space, a holy space that only you could fill with truth, with tenderness, with presence. And now people find you. They don't always know why. They show up with stories they've never spoken. They sit beside you and cry about things they swore they'd already healed. And you don't flinch, because you know the smell of unspoken grief. You know the taste of trying to make sense of things that never made sense. You know how to speak in the language of broken souls, without making them feel broken. That's your ministry now, not from a pulpit, not with a microphone, but with presence, with the eyes that see the child still hiding inside a grown person, with the voice that says, "You are not too much. You are just not used to being fully seen." You don't need to fix them. You don't need to explain them. You don't need to carry them the way you once carried your family's silence. You just need to stay, to become the stillness that once saved you, to become the room where no one is asked to shrink, just to fit inside. And one day, maybe it's already happened, someone will look at you, trembling, and say, "You feel like home." And you'll smile, not because it doesn't still hurt sometimes, but because now you understand. The room they never talked about was never meant to be reopened. It was meant to be rebuilt. And you've been rebuilding it all along. Every boundary, every pause, every breath you took before choosing compassion instead of control. Brick by brick, word by word, you turn a grave into a garden. And now, you don't live in their shadows. You cast light. So if you're wondering, what's next? Here's your answer. Let them in. Let the weary find your presence and exhale. Let the silence speak again. Let the forgotten feel remembered. Let the angry learn softness. Let the shame be held without question. You don't have to carry them. You just have to be, because the room your family never talked about has become the sanctuary that heaven never stopped building. And that sanctuary, beloved, has your name written all over it. Epilogue, there's a stillness that arrives when you stop needing the apology, when the story no longer burns on your tongue, when the echo of their silence becomes just background noise, not prophecy. And in that stillness, a shift happens. You stop looking for closure. You start becoming the continuation. You no longer knock on old doors, hoping someone will recognize you. You realize you were never meant to live in borrowed spaces. You were always meant to build your own, not from revenge, not from resentment, but from remembrance, the sacred kind, the kind that doesn't keep score, the kind that says, "I remember who I am now, and I don't need you to remember me for me to exist." That's what healing sounds like. Not loud, not grand, but whole. You light candles now in rooms you've made with your own hands. You laugh in spaces where once you only wept. You raise your voice, not to be heard, but because there's music again in your chest. You tend to others without sacrificing yourself. You hold space without disappearing inside it. You show up not as a survivor, but as a sacred architect of wholeness. And maybe, just maybe, that was the plan all along. Not for you to escape the room, but to carry its memory into a house you'd build for those who would come after. A house where no child is told they're too much, where silence is not a strategy, but a moment of rest, where voices don't echo because they're unheard. They echo because they're honored. And so now, you open your doors with no fear. You let love in without conditions. You build tables longer than your pain, and say to every trembling soul who enters, you don't have to explain your wounds here. This house knows the shape of them already. You're safe. You're sacred. You're home. Because the room your family never talked about was never just a wound. It was a seed. And today, it's grown into a garden, a temple, a house built by the hands of someone who was never supposed to survive, but did. And now, you are the door others walk through to find their own freedom. This is no longer the story of what they didn't say. It's the story of what you finally chose to live.